Okay, yeah, I think we are recording. Keon, can you please confirm looks like it's recording to the cloud?
Yep, on
Awesome.
the upper left.
Great, appreciate that, thank you. Okay, thank you all for joining today. My name is Kevin Delano. I'm a geologist in the Division of Water Rights at the State Water Resources Control Board. Today is the first of 3 webinars that our modeling team, our project team is giving as a update on our development of surface water, groundwater, and nitrogen transport models of the Ventura River watershed. Today's topics are an overview and status update for the groundwater, surface water, and nitrogen transport models. And we're also going to review the geologic analysis that our team did and present updates we've made to that geologic analysis since publication of a revised geologic memo in 2020. And so this project team is comprised of staff from the State Water Resources Control Board and the Division of Water Rights and the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board and the Total Maximum Daily Load and Non-Point Source Unit. And we're working with our consultants, Geosyntec and Daniel B. Stevenson Associates. And so normally with a meeting, any kind of public meeting, I'd like to do introductions and go around the table and learn who everyone is that's here. Unfortunately, with a meeting of this size, we have nearly 100 people in the audience, including our presenting team. We don't really have time for that. So from the project team, we'll be introducing ourselves as it's our turn to speak. You'll be hearing from most of the folks that are listed here. You'll be hearing from most of us throughout this webinar today, this morning. And we do want to hear from you, the audience, our technical experts that we've invited and the broader watershed community that we've invited. And so we will have an opportunity to hear from you throughout the webinar. This contact info will be repeated at the end of the webinar. So you can always get in touch with any of us at the water boards. Okay, so as I was saying earlier, due to the large size of this meeting and the Zoom format, all known host participants at the start of the meeting don't have permission to unmute or turn on their video. That being said, during the presentations, we'll have pauses for questions, probably about 3 to 5 minutes long. And we want to hear from you during those pauses for questions. And then we also are going to have 40 minutes for discussion at the end. So if you want to ask a question, great, please do it. That's why we're doing these webinars, is to get feedback and to hear questions. So if you want to ask a question, you can either type it in chat or click the raise hand button. The raise hand button, if you haven't tried it already, is on the bottom of your Zoom window. There should be a button that says reactions. And then if you click on reactions, there should be a button that says raise hand. My colleague Ojal Hassan is monitoring both the chat and the raise hands. And as questions come in or hands are raised, we'll kind of put you in a queue for questions. And when we get to stops for questions, we will take those. So we do want to hear from you. If you raise your hand, we'll give you permission to unmute so that you can talk to us and we can talk to you. And that permission will stay with you for the rest of the webinar. Just please remember to mute yourself if I'm getting background noise from anyone, whether it's my project team or anyone in the audience. I'll just mute you. It's nothing personal. It's just to reduce background noise. Finally, instructions for downloading the slides and viewing the recording will be available at the end. Like we said, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube. So if you want to test that raise hand feature or test posting questions in the chat, I encourage you to do so. And if you miss those instructions at the end for downloading the slides or for viewing the recording, please contact myself or any of the water board staff and we'll help you get that information. So like I said, this is the first of 3 webinars that we're going to host to serve a couple different goals. So the first goal of this webinar series is to review the background of our Ventura River modeling project. This project started in 2017, and so we just want to review the arc of the project that began then and the steps that we've gone along the way so far, and finally where we're at today and what comes next. So we want to provide updates on model development, and we're really excited to share new information with you, some new, I call it like preliminary information that we want to get feedback on. So we're really doing these also to solicit technical comments on new information, specifically revisions to geology, our representation of water demand and distribution in the surface water groundwater model, and our preliminary calibration and validation results for the surface water groundwater model. And we'll also be sharing next steps on how to stay involved in the third webinar. So like I said, today is the first webinar of 3. The next one is on May 19th. The third webinar is on June 9th, which is 3 weeks after the second. Each meeting has a unique RSVP link. So if you'd like to join the other webinars, you must RSVP for them to get a Zoom link or a phone number to join. Please, so we are doing these webinars to solicit technical comment on this preliminary kind of modeling result information. And this is not your only chance to review these draft models. In fact, the draft models themselves and the draft model report will be coming out later. And so this is kind of getting ahead of that. We're hoping that folks can help us flag major or minor technical issues as early as possible ahead of release of the draft models and draft model report. I also want to acknowledge that it's difficult to provide comments from an oral presentation. And so to help facilitate that, like I mentioned, we will make the slides and the meeting recording available to view after this. And we'll be doing that for all 3 webinars. And as a team, we're available to talk to you. So if you, oh, excuse me, that's my timer. If you have questions or you need additional context or anything like that would help you provide technical comments, please don't hesitate to contact myself or any of the water board staff, and we can set up some meetings to talk with you and help answer your questions. So we really do want to help solicit those technical comments and help you give us the best feedback possible. So this is the first webinar. You're going to hear from water board staff for about the next 35 minutes. And we'll give you a background on the origin of these modeling projects in the Ventura watershed. We'll give a technical introduction to the models. And then we're going to review the project history and past outreach that we've done, which, like I said, began in 2017. We're going to hand the presentation over to Geosyntec. That's our surface water modeling team and water quality modeling team at 9:45 to 10:30. And they're going to give you a technical overview of the models. Excuse me. At 10:30, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back at 10:45 to hear from Daniel B. Stevens and Associates, and they're going to review their geologic analysis that they've done for this project and, present new information that they've incorporated since publication of a revised geologic memo in 2020. Our goal is to have 40 minutes for discussion at the end, and we want that to be pretty free form. So our hope is, we'll be unmuting lots of people either for the discussion or ahead of it so that we can get lots of good technical conversation going. We'll be wrapping up around 11:55 with some reminders and instructions for accessing the meeting and slides. And like I said, if you have to leave early, we will make that, just contact us and we can give you that information for accessing the slides and the meeting recording. So I just want to reiterate that there are pauses for questions during these 3 presentations ahead of the discussion. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Dan Worth, my supervisor.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Daniel Worth. I'm a senior environmental scientist within the State Water Board's Division of Water Rights. And I'm part of a team within Water Rights working on an effort to enhance in-stream flows in multiple watersheds throughout the state. This effort to enhance in-stream flows was first identified in the California Water Action Plan in 2014 and supports actions within Governor Newsom's water resilience portfolio. Both of these plans identify improving in-stream flow conditions as necessary management actions for the protection of native fish species, many of which are at or near historically low population levels, and some are threatened with extinction. Next slide, please. Action 4 within the Water Action Plan is to restore important ecosystems. And this action contains a sub-action to enhance water flows in stream systems statewide. The sub-action reads, the State Water Resources Control Board and the Department of Fish and Wildlife will implement a suite of individual and coordinated administrative efforts to enhance flows statewide in at least 5 stream systems that support critical habitat for anadromous fish. And as a reminder, anadromous fish are those that reproduce in freshwater, but use the ocean during part of their life. And it includes species like salmon, steelhead, sturgeon, and lamprey. Next slide, please. The 5 watersheds that were identified as the starting point for the flow enhancement efforts are the Shasta River, South Fork Eel River, Mill Creek, Mark West Creek, and the Ventura River. The Instream Flows unit, which Kevin and I are part of, is working on 4 of these watersheds, and the 5th watershed, Mill Creek, falls within our Bay Delta program efforts. Next slide, please. The goal of our effort within these watersheds is to enhance in-stream flows. As part of this effort, we are working to develop and implement in-stream flow objectives. Developing flow objectives will give us management targets that we can start working towards. And once objectives are identified, there may be different ways to achieve the objectives. For example, there could be new regulations, locally led solutions, watershed agreements, or other implementation mechanisms. Next slide. This slide shows the big picture roadmap of our process to develop and implement flow objectives. The process starts with research and information gathering, including flow studies and recommendations, researching water supply and water demand, and developing groundwater surface water hydrologic models. This also involves a process to balance the various beneficial uses of water, including many opportunities for public input along the way. It will include an environmental impact assessment in the form of a CEQA document or substitute environmental document. It will also include implementation through a regulation or other mechanisms. After implementation, there's expected to be ongoing work such as effectiveness monitoring and adaptive management. Next slide, please. This slide helps to differentiate flow criteria from flow objectives. Flow criteria identify flow needs of fish. For example, passage flows or rearing flows or spawning flows. And flow criteria have no regulatory effect. Flow objectives do have regulatory effect, and they balance the needs of public trust resources and other beneficial uses of water. Beneficial uses of surface water and groundwater in the Ventura River watershed are designated within the LA Regional Water Board's Basin Plan. Next slide, please. In the Ventura River watershed, the effort to enhance in-stream flows is roughly divvied up as shown here. CDFW is conducting in-stream flow studies to inform development of flow criteria and recommendations. CDFW is also has ongoing fish and wildlife monitoring activities in the watershed, as well as permitting and regulatory activities, which are sometimes related to flow. The State Water Board is developing a surface water groundwater model, which will provide water supply, water demand, in-stream flow, surface water and groundwater interaction information. We are coordinating with the Regional Water Board on this effort to develop a water quality model in the watershed, which will be further described in the next few slides. We've also been coordinating with other water management efforts in the Ventura River watershed, often sharing data and sharing information. We'll go through a process to develop balanced flow objectives, and we'll ensure implementation of the flow objectives. After implementation, the State Water Board will likely be part of ongoing implementation and monitoring activities within the watershed. I'm now going to turn the slides over to our staff at the LA Regional Water Board to talk about water quality. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. My name is Alexander Prescott, and I'm an environmental scientist with the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board. And here with me today is my supervisor, Dr. Jun Ju, Chief of the TMDL and Non-Point Source Unit. The Ventura River watershed was identified in the 1998, 2002, 2006, and 2010 Clean Water Act, Section 303D list of impaired water bodies due to algae, eutrophic conditions, low dissolved oxygen, and nitrogen. In 2012, the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board adopted a total maximum daily load, or TMDL, for algae, eutrophic conditions, nutrients in the Ventura River and its tributaries. A TMDL is a planning document that identifies the maximum amount of a pollutant that can enter a water body while still meeting water quality standards. The TMDL assigns waste load allocations to point sources of pollution and load allocations to non-point sources of pollution. In the Ventura River algae TMDL, the load allocations of nitrogen and phosphorus were assigned to on-site wastewater treatment system, or OTS, agriculture, horse and intensive livestock facilities, as well as grazing. These load allocations take the form of pounds of total nitrogen and total phosphorus discharged per day under both wet and dry conditions. However, at the time of TMDL adoption, source assessments for agricultural, septic systems, and livestock discharges of nutrients to surface water via groundwater flow were not available. The Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board is a participating funding agency for this modeling effort, through which we will have a better understanding of how groundwater may discharge nutrients to the surface water. Next slide, please. While specific source assessments for agricultural, septic systems, and livestock discharges of nutrients to surface water via groundwater flow were not available in 2012, it was possible to estimate the total load of nitrogen from groundwater to surface water. Groundwater can often contain elevated concentrations of nutrients from natural and anthropogenic sources, and groundwater is known to rise to the surface in this watershed, particularly in the lower Ventura River, where it provides base flow and is the dominant source of water in the dry season. The estimated groundwater discharge volume to surface water for the lower Ventura River subbasin is 1,254 acre-feet per year, or about 1.73 CFS. The average nitrate concentration in groundwater is about 1.23 milligrams per liter, as measured in surrounding wells with depths from 30 to 100 feet below the surface. Using this simple calculation, staff was able to estimate the loading of nitrogen from groundwater to surface water and determine that groundwater contributed 4,192 pounds of nitrogen per year to the lower Ventura River subbasin alone. Through this modeling effort, we intend to not only more accurately quantify the total load of nitrogen from groundwater to surface water, but also to determine the original sources of that nitrogen and the associated travel time. Next slide, please. Additional research has been conducted since the adoption of the TMDL, including the determination of areas where OTS discharge likely affects surface water quality. High and medium risk areas for groundwater upwells down gradient from areas with high OTS densities can be seen here in pink and in red. Red areas indicates where OTS discharge is likely affecting surface water quality, and pink areas indicate where OTS discharge is likely affecting groundwater quality and potentially affecting surface water quality. Efforts like this and others have provided valuable information that has been utilized to inform the groundwater surface water hydrogeologic and nitrogen transport modeling efforts. Building on previous research, the nitrogen transport model component of this study will simulate how groundwater is transported to the surface and will include mass balance solute transport modeling that we will use to develop accurate source assessments for agricultural, septic systems, and livestock discharges of nutrients to surface water via groundwater flow. Thank you. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Kevin.
There we go. We got 3 to 5 minutes here for questions. Ojal, do we have any questions yet?
We do not have any questions yet.
Would anyone like to ask any questions? We'll just kind of hold here for a moment, give people the opportunity to raise their hand or write questions in the chat. I would love to be able to unmute someone right now. I see we've got a question. Okay, I think I saw a hand go up first. That's Heidi George, and then we have a question in chat from Diana Engel, so we'll go in that order.
Heidi, you're unmuted. You can ask your question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, I'm very interested in what might be happening where the Los Padres National Forest enters into the pink area downstream of the I guess in that last image, in the likely groundwater nitrogen input. And maybe you can help me understand if there is any surface water infiltration that might be influencing that pink area from the Los Padres National Forest, or if that's even on your radar. Thank you.
Heidi, I'm gonna try and clarify your question. So are you asking about quantification of surface water going into groundwater at the boundary of the Los Padres National Forest?
Hi, sorry, I muted myself and then I couldn't. Well, let me rephrase it. I'm not really familiar with this info yet, and what it can do for the Los Padres in terms of thinking about how we can support this, this effort. My understanding of the pink area, so I might be wrong here, is that it's a potential risk of surface water influence, including, contaminants like nitrogen, but maybe that's not part of it. So let's leave that out. So just in terms of surface water that might come off of the Los Padres National Forest into this groundwater basin that we're talking about, is there anything that you might identify that would help us to be able to be aware of it, and be able to address it?
Kevin, if it's helpful for me to answer this, let me know.
Yeah. I do want to add a qualifying or clarifying statement. So the Los Padres National Forest, as I understand it, borders both the Upper Ventura groundwater basin and the Ojal Basin. But go ahead, Brandon.
Yes, so this is Brandon Steets of Geosyntech. I was a principal investigator of the septic study that's shown here. This is a monitoring-based study where we used a combination of nutrient and septic and sewage indicators like ammonia, nitrate isotopes, and pharmaceuticals and personal care products. And we used monitoring in both groundwater and surface waters at areas where there's known groundwater to surface water, so rising or exfiltrating groundwater to surface water interactions, to combined with septic density information to spatially define areas of nitrate influence from septics to surface waters, and to achieve the objectives of TMDL improvement, as Alexander described very well. And so I think, Heidi, what you're asking about are the locations that are more towards the north here, that more closely abut the wilderness portions of kind of the edge of the urban development. And those are the bedrock portions of our analysis. There was more chemical influence seen in the bedrock portions. As you can imagine, you have like less organics, you have more transmissivity where you have a lot of fractured bedrock. And so there's more chemical transport there. Now that's based on monitoring data, which has inherent limitations. We had as much sampling as we had budget to do. So the purpose of the current study that's being described now is to describe a modeling effort that when we add groundwater solute or chemical transport, we'll be able to refine these spatial defined areas. So you might look at the figure here as a work in progress, and new information will hopefully improve this information so that we can do a better job of defining exactly which septic areas are most influential over nutrients and algae in surface waters. So I would say maybe hold off on action items unless the regional board says otherwise. They're the ones who kind of run the TMDL and the implementation plan. And hopefully this project will help to improve what the implementation actions should be.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much. I did, I was thinking downward infiltration instead of upward upwelling, so I appreciate that.
Okay, this
We-
is. Oh, go ahead.
We have two questions in the chat. One from Diana.
Yeah, let's.
And
Sorry, go ahead.
do we have enough time to answer two questions, or do you want to park them?
I think we should. Can we park them until the next question spot and then come around to both?
Sure.
Okay, and I asked that Geosyntic and LA Regional Board look at the chat because these are both septic related questions. So get a heads up on those. Okay, so we're going to keep going just to stay on schedule. We'll come back to those questions. So thank you. And Heidi, if you have additional questions, please follow up with any of us at the water boards. Okay, so I'm going to just give a brief technical introduction to the models that we're developing. So the State Water Resources Control Board, our need with the surface water groundwater model is to have a tool. These models are tools. We need a tool that can help inform development of balanced flow objectives. The nitrogen transport model will help the LA Regional Water Quality Control Board understand where nitrogen is loaded into the groundwater at what quantities, rates, timing, and then how that nitrogen travels through the groundwater and where it daylights into surface water. Early on in this project, we recognized an opportunity to develop a tool that also could support local water management efforts. We wanted to develop a tool that complies with SGMA. One of the very first questions, we wanted to develop a tool that would be available to the community, that the local groundwater sustainability agencies could use, and other local water managers in the watershed could use to make local water management decisions. And that is our goal. We do want local solutions here in this watershed. So to that end, for the surface water groundwater model, we selected a modeling platform called GSFLOW, which complies with SGMA. It's a free public domain modeling software that is maintained by the US Geological Survey and regularly updated and fixed. And that was preferential to us rather than using, say, a proprietary modeling code that is maintained by a private company that would require a license and therefore be harder to use, prohibitively expensive potentially. So we're using a free public domain modeling software that's used by some groundwater sustainability agencies in California. And additionally, as I'm going to describe in some of the coming slides, we've done kind of an extensive amount of public engagement to inform development of this model. And our goal with this public engagement, which is ongoing and will continue, is to build local understanding of the model, to build local buy-in, and to hopefully build acceptance and confidence in the model so that this model can be a tool that can be shared and used to make water management decisions. And we're also going to pay for local modelers to learn how to use this model. So I'll talk about more on that later. So what are the technical capabilities that we need the model to have? It needs to be able to simulate historic conditions. Our model calibration period is 1994 to 2017. And then we're also going to have a recalibration for the post-Thomas Fire years of 2018 to 2020. The model needs to be able to simulate a full range of water year types. And as was said earlier, we need to be able to understand how much water is available in the watershed. Where does precipitation go? What are the transit times? What are the quantities that are available? How do groundwater and surface water interact? We also need to understand water demand. What are all the water uses, all the beneficial uses of water in the watershed? And we want to understand the effects of water demand on groundwater levels and surface water flows. For the regional board, there's a need to estimate how nitrogen is loaded into the groundwater and hence where that nitrogen daylights into surface water. And finally, both these models are tools that can evaluate scenarios. So with the surface water groundwater model, we can evaluate potential water management scenarios, such as a groundwater sustainability plan. We could evaluate something like a draft flow recommendation from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. We could run an unimpaired flow scenario that tells us how much water exist in the watershed if there were 0 diversions. There's a water budget. We can look at scenarios such as Matilaha dam removal or the impacts of climate change. We could evaluate a local cooperative agreement where there's voluntary water conservation and land use changes. So that's a really exciting capability of the model that we know, I think everyone is interested in. With my remaining slides, I'm just going to review the project history. So this contract started in 2017. That's when we started working with Geosyntec and DB Stevens. So in 2017, we released a draft study plan, and in 2018, we released a draft geologic analysis. So the purpose of these first 2 draft documents, well, the purpose of the draft study plan was to outline our model development roadmap. These are the kind of key model development steps that we're going to take. We put that out for a long comment period. The Thomas fire did occur while we had that document out. And so we held our first TAC meeting. So we had formed a TAC in 2017. We held our first meeting and got some really good critical feedback on our approach. And about a year later, we released a draft geologic analysis memo that described the geologic analysis, our understanding of geology in the watershed that is necessary to kind of set up the groundwater portion of the groundwater surface water model. So we also held a comment period on that document. We held a TAC meeting. So both these documents had public and TAC comment periods that occurred at the same time, and we got a lot of feedback on both documents. And coming out of both documents, we recognized a need and an opportunity to make several changes to our modeling approach and to our overall scope of work. And so we actually executed a contract amendment in 2019, and we expanded our scope of work. In 2019, we published a final study plan that describes our new scope of work. And one purpose of that final study plan was to show that we've made changes to this project. We've listened to your comments, and this is how we've expanded the project in response to your comments and other identified needs. So for example, we added new technical work, such as modeling groundwater and bedrock. We added more scenarios, such as a post-Thomas fire scenario. We added new technical memos that really dive into one aspect of the surface water groundwater model development that was not described in the study plan. So with these memos, we wanted to make sure that our technical experts and others could review aspects of model development that were not mentioned in the study plan. And people were like, what about this? We want to have the opportunity to review this aspect of model development. And we added funding and public outreach for these memos and for the other draft documents that were coming. And we also included local training for modelers to learn how to use this model. So to that end, we published, we finalized the study plan, published in 2019. We published a revised geo memo in 2020 that incorporated new information that was provided to us and comments that were provided. Then in 2020, we really got back on track with releasing new draft documents. We released a draft data compilation report that describes all the information we've compiled for this project. And we talk about data gaps and how we're trying to address those. We talk about multiple data sets that were available and decisions, and if we made a decision to use one data set over another. And then in 2020, we also released the first of those memos that describe that, talk about one aspect of model development that wasn't addressed in the final study plan. So 4 draft documents since 2017, each one had at least a 30-day TAC and public comment period. And we've been receiving, comments on all these documents. So we really appreciate the sustained engagement. This is what's coming next. So this is an updated version of a table from the final study plan, which was a kind of a schedule. So we've completed the data report and a sensitivity memo. We are currently giving an update on the surface water groundwater model calibration and validation. That's how this webinar series started, as we wanted to give the community an update on how the model's coming along before we publish the models and the modeling report. So as this webinar series, we'll talk about calibration and validation, but we have other new information that we're excited to share. The next document, or I should say the next deliverable we're going to release is the models, the draft models, I should say, and the draft modeling report. Our goal is to release that document by the end of 2021. Our goal is to release the draft models and the draft model report by the end of 2021. The model report will include results, draft results, for one GSFLOW scenario, which is unimpaired flow, and will include the results for all nitrogen transport model scenarios. That's the MT3D-USGS model. To help meet this timeline, we've actually postponed development of our other scenarios and publication of those scenario results. So we have budget for 7 other GSFLOW scenarios, and we'll be talking more about those in webinar 3. We've determined what a few of those will be, and we want public comment on what the remaining 4 should be. And then we'll, of course, publish results on those scenarios once we run them. So I'm just going to wrap up here. I want to get back to questions. So I just want to thank the kind of sustained engagement we've had from both the Technical Advisory Committee and the broader Watershed community over the course of development of these modeling tools. We formed a Technical Advisory Committee in 2017, and we've had representation from all these different entities listed on the left. We've also benefited from the participation of additional local technical persons that we didn't initially invite, but they kind of showed up at our TAC meetings and had really great feedback. So we thank everyone for their constructive feedback. We thank the Watershed Council for letting us attend, to listen, to build relationships, to provide updates, presentations, and we will continue to use these venues and these this public engagement format as model development continues. I just want to finally add that we use these formal comment periods to get feedback, but our working relationships, these formal comment periods have led to really helpful working relationships that kind of persist throughout the year. So we just want to thank everyone that has provided comments either during a comment period or outside of one. We thank everyone that has answered, whether it's a single email that I send you and it's one question, or it's months of meetings and back and forth, and us making lots of data requests to your organization. We really just thank everyone for all the kind of sustained working relationships that we've been able to have. We look forward to continuing those. Through these relationships, we've been able to identify appropriate data sources to use. We've received data. We've been able to provide information to help whatever those local efforts are. We've gotten feedback on model development, and this has all been helpful, and it's all improved model development. And so we're just really grateful and looking forward to continuing those working relationships. And with that, I'm done talking. So let's go to questions.
We have one question part from the previous session from Dan. The question is, the septic tank study omitted an area known failed septics, the Arbolada. Will you correct that? I think this is a question for the regional board.
I think that one might be passed to me. This is Brandon, a geosyntech, and I just confirmed with Al that the Arbolada area, just west of the boundary of the city of Ojal, it was added to the data set that you'll see Al present in a bit. So it is part of this modeling study, and the commenter, I think that was Diana, is correct that it was not included in the data sets that we were provided, which is the County of Ventura's data set in the monitoring study, which is, it doesn't affect the results because we only had limited budget to monitor certain representative areas. Whereas the model can numerically address all areas geographically across the watershed. So it'll be useful information to now have in the model so we have the right volumes and masses of nitrogen entering groundwater. Hopefully that answers the question. Thank you.
Okay. Ojal, what's the next question that we've got?
Some questions were answered by Alexander. Thank you, Alexander. There is one outstanding question also from Dan. Please provide a link to the full report. Can I check to see if the septic inside the city of Ojal boundaries and the Arbolada neighborhood were added back in after the draft report?
Alexander or June, is that something that we can post in the chat, a link to the report?
Yeah, I think it would be easier if then just send us a follow-up email, and then we can get back to him later.
Okay. So June and Alexander's email addresses are on the screen right now. Thank you, Diana, for those questions.
There is a raised hand from Brian Bundy. You are unmute. You can ask your question.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a quick comment, if I may. Kevin mentioned several times the model and being used for groundwater sustainability planning. I just want to help avoid potential confusion from stakeholders out there that the timing of the GSPs for the two basins are they're due basically in January of 2022. And I can't speak for OBGMA, but I'm working for Upper Ventura River. And I just want to make sure the stakeholders understand that there's a separate modeling effort for the Upper Ventura River Basin to comply with the requirements of SGMA. And that modeling effort is being undertaken by the Upper Ventura River Groundwater Agency, the GSA for the basin. I just want to make sure folks are aware that there's multiple modeling efforts going on and that this particular model that you're learning about today is not the model that's being used for at least the Upper Ventura River Groundwater Sustainability Plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that, Brian. And yeah, we just, unfortunately, the timeline doesn't quite work out that, we're still in a preliminary state. And so our modeling effort, I don't think is not quite available in time for the Upper Ventura GSA to use. So thank you for clarifying that.
I don't think we have any outstanding questions.
I caught one from William Warrick. I apologize if I got that incorrect. Golden State Water Company no longer exists. This is now Community Facilities District. When will this be corrected? Yeah, we're aware that Golden State was, the last I had heard was that Casitas Municipal Water District had taken over operation of Golden State's well field and for the city of Ojal. So I apologize that the map doesn't communicate that. And if that information is incorrect, that if there's new management of the former Golden State well field, then please tell us that. Please let me know if that answers your question, William.
Yeah, and Kevin, this is Al. I can add to that. We still kind of use the Golden State Water Company data, the historical data behind the model. So that's why we use it on the map. I believe it was transferred in 2017 or maybe 2018. So it's kind of just a terminology that we stuck with for convenience, that we could certainly come up with something that's less ambiguous.
And we have a comment from Jordan Keir. The model you were learning about today is not applied for the OBGMA Groundwater Sustainability Plan. So thank you for clarifying that too. So our goal is that our hope is that the groundwater sustainability agencies are open to using these modeling tools for perhaps their 5-year updates. The models will definitely be available in time for those. I also received a direct message question. How will the CDFW study be integrated with the State Water Board's hydrology study? That's a great question. I'm actually going to table that, and we're going to come back to that question later. So that's definitely a topic that I expect people want to hear about. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Al Preston. We're about 5 minutes behind where I was hoping we'd be, so let's just keep this rolling. So I'm going to take down my screen, Al, and it's all yours. So thank you for these questions. Keep them coming.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So my name's Al Preston. I'm a principal at Geocenter Consultants. I sit in our downtown Los Angeles office. I'm a modeler by background, and I'm the PM on this project. I'm just going to share my presentation. So thank you, Kevin, Dan, and Alexander, for providing a great background. In the next 40 or so minutes, I'm going to talk about some of the technical details behind the models. Okay, I'm just checking. Can you guys see the PowerPoint. Let me put it in. Can you guys see a full screen?
Yep.
Perfect. So the two models I'm going to talk about are the GSFLOW model, and this is the model that does the surface water hydrology, and it calculates how the water arriving at the land surface through precipitation runs off into the streams, percolates into the groundwater, and also comes back from the groundwater to the surface water. So it really deals with volumes of water and how it moves throughout the watershed. And it will be used to answer a lot of the questions posed by the state. How do we best use this scarce resource? How do we come up with some reasonable flow objectives that kind of balance the needs of people in the watershed, or people and habitat in the watershed? So that's the GSFLOW model. The second model is a separate model that's going to be developed, that is a MODFLOW model coupled with MT3D, and this does solute transport through the groundwater. And this is going to be used to evaluate the transport of nitrogen from various sources throughout the watershed, as Alexander described, into and through the groundwater and back into the surface water. So really trying to get at, is that estimate of 4,200 pounds per year accurate? And more than that, what are the individual contributions to that load? So for each of these two models, I'm going to give an overview of the structure, like how the models work, and kind of a big picture overview, and then talk about the data. There's a lot of data that goes into both setting up the models with the model input, and also to calibrate the models to make sure that the models are representing what is happening in the watershed. So first, the GSFLOW model. So GSFLOW is, as mentioned by Kevin, is supported by and developed and supported by the USGS. GSFLOW stands for Groundwater Surface Water Flow Model. It is a coupling of the well-known MODFLOW model, which is the groundwater model, plus the PRMS, or Precipitation Runoff Modeling System. Both of these models have been developed separately by the USGS, and in kind of around 2008, they kind of coupled the two together. So they enabled the models to exchange information as, for instance, as surface water percolated through the soil into groundwater, it will give that information to MODFLOW. If then MODFLOW predicts that water can come back to the surface water, that will pass information back to PRMS. So basically it's joined two models together. It's worth noting that the PRMS model uses a gridded approach, so it's a hydrology model. It uses a gridded approach. More traditional hydrology models may use different shaped HRUs, but the gridded approach lets the model be coupled nicely with the gridded approach of the MODFLOW model. And just to give you an idea, in the Ventura River watershed, our model, I believe, has about 200,000 elements on the surface. So, we're dealing with fairly complex models with lots of calculations going on. So this is kind of a schematic overview. I think this picture maybe tells the story a little more clearly. It's kind of a nice picture of a typical watershed. So the overall big picture is what GSFLOW represents. Above the dashed line is the surface water hydrology model, which is PRMS, Precipitation Runoff Modeling System. It deals with precipitation, so we apply precipitation at the land surface. Some of that infiltrates, some of it evaporates, some of it runs off into stream flows, some of it percolates through into the unsaturated zone. And then below the dashed line is the MODFLOW model. So it has the unsaturated zone, it has the saturated zone. It can have uptake from the saturated zone through plants. It can discharge, the groundwater can discharge to streams. Streams can also recharge the groundwater through leakage. You can put in wells, which is very important because there's a lot of wells in the Ventura River watershed. And it can also have lakes, and it can have transfers of also water you know, see human-induced transfers of water throughout the watershed. So again, going back to more of a schematic representation, this is just a figure taken from the GSFLOW manual. It kind of talks about 3 regions. Region 1 is the upper layer. It deals with plants, storage of water in the soils, and that's the precipitation runoff modeling system, or PRMS. Regions 2 and 3 are both simulated by MODFLOW. This schematic says MODFLOW 2005. It's since been updated. It now uses MODFLOW NWT. And you see the streams and lakes have interactions with the subsurface and unsaturated zones. In addition, there is the hydrology model provides surface runoff and interflow information to the streams and lakes. And there's also two-way interaction potentially between the surface hydrology and the saturated and unsaturated groundwater underneath. So this is a schematic. Now I'm going to dive a little more into each of the details of the PRMS model and the MODFLOW before getting into the data specifics for Ventura River Watershed. So this is a schematic of the PRMS. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but it's, it's a fully comprehensive hydrologic model that has all the hydrological processes in it. It has precipitation, solar radiation, has interception from plants. It can have snowpack, although we haven't activated that for Ventura. I think it does snow occasionally, but it really doesn't play a big part in any water budget. It's got storage of water in different soil zones and subsurface reservoirs. So it needs a lot of data to set up and drive these models. It needs meteorology to define how much rain is hitting the land, and also temperature to define how quickly that may evaporate back out of the system. It needs land use, which can influence how much water can be stored in these different buckets, if you will. And there's many calibration parameters. You need to kind of define the storage volumes for each of these buckets, and also the rates of transfer between the buckets and from the soil to the streams, etc. Now the PRMS has a fairly simplistic groundwater reservoir acting as its groundwater model, and the idea of GSFLOW is basically to replace that with a MODFLOW model, so a fully gridded 3-dimensional groundwater simulation. And that's how these things play together. But the important takeaways are that there's a lot of, you need a lot of data and there's a lot of calibration parameters to calibrate the surface water model, PRMS model. Moving on to MODFLOW. MODFLOW has been around for many decades. So typically you take your groundwater basins, and in our case also bedrock. You divide them into different zones of alluvium, bedrock, and you split them up into these cells, and you can solve the the groundwater flow equations in 3 dimensions. And this model also needs additional calibration parameters, notably the hydraulic conductivity and storativity for each of the different zones, information on conductance and leakance from streams and lakes. So again, there's another set of parameters for the MODFLOW model that must also be calibrated. And we're not going to talk about the calibration in this webinar, but the third webinar is when we're going to talk about the model calibration. So the GSFLOW calibration data, I'm kind of turning this around backwards. I think it's helpful to see what the goals of the model are before we talk about all the input data. So I'm going to kind of show what the goal of the model is, and that is, simply put, the goal is to accurately reflect where the water from precipitation ends up. Some of it goes into the soil and runs into streams, some percolates into the ground. So by comparing model results with as much measured data as we can get our hands on, we can have confidence that a model is able to correctly reproduce the movement of water within the watershed. As Kevin mentioned, our modeling period is 1994 to 2017. So I'm going to talk about the data we have over that period. We've got stream gauge data, so measurements of flow within the streams. We've got hydrograph data, so measurement of water elevations in the groundwater. And then we've also got wet-dry mapping by Casitas Municipal Water District, who do surveys pretty frequently, actually. And during the calibration, we make plots of these different things, and also we'll also calculate statistics. But again, that's going to be in webinar number 3. So I'm just going to go through a couple of examples of these types of data sets here. So this is a map of the watershed showing the stream gauges. The ones I want you to pay attention to are the blue ones. They're the active gauges. They have daily stream flow data. And I've got a couple of examples on the left. These are time series of flow rate over the entire 24-year modeling period. This is one up in North Fork, Matilda. It's on a log scale, so we can see we get low flows in the summers, high flows in the winters, as you'd expect. And then another example is down near Foster Park, and we get similar trends. We do get lower low flows, and that's due to the interactions with the groundwater, and we also get higher high flows just because it's further down in the watershed. So again, the goal would be to be able to reproduce the trends within at each of these stream flow gauge locations. We've also got hydrographs. I think there were 64 wells within the watershed that measure elevations of groundwater. This is an example up in the Ojal Basin, and you can see response of the hydrograph to dry periods. The early 2000s was dry. A wet year, I think that was 2005, where the groundwater basin, I think almost completely filled up again. And then more recently, the drought, the 2012 through 16 drought, where the groundwater elevations have been low for an extended period of time. So the goal of the groundwater calibration is to try and match these trends. This is just another example, another hydrograph up in the upper Ventura River, and kind of similar but slightly different trends. The variation in this graph is only about 50 feet, whereas in the previous graph was about 100 feet. Again, just another example of the types of data that we're trying to reproduce with the model. These are examples of the wet-dry maps. These are collected by Casitas Municipal Water District. Both maps here are in July. The one on the left is 2011, which is a relatively wet year. And we see that even in July, most of the river is wet. There's the dry reach in the kind of upper part of the Ventura River. If you contrast that with 2014, which is a couple of years into the drought, we see that, probably about half of the Ventura River is dry at this point. So the goal of the model would be to reproduce these types of patterns, differences between wet years and dry years, and get a match, because clearly being able to reproduce things such as this is important to quantify effects on fish passage and things like that. So that's kind of the data we're trying to match the model to. I'll take a little pause here if there's some questions before moving on to some of the input data that we use.
Al, I just want to jump in really quick and say that in addition to Casitas Municipal Water District and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, we did receive wet-dry mapping from other organizations as well. So,
yes, thanks.
Are there any questions? First question in chat, could you explain how you selected your validation years?
Yeah, it was a combination of having enough data and a reasonable time period. 20 years I think was the goal, and we look back and there was some pretty good data going through to the early 90s. That generally over time there's more data and generally better data. And then we wanted to do a calibration and validation period. That the challenge was, and typically you do it, the calibration first part of the model and the validation in the second part. The challenge was the drought near the end of our modeling period. We wanted to have, I think, at least one of those drought years in our calibration period. So that's kind of why we broke it where it is.
Could you also speak to our, I'm sorry, but could you also speak to why the calibration years were selected, which 1994 to I think roughly 2015 or so?
Yeah, I think it was basically you've only got resources to a certain length of model runtime of model. This model that we're running takes a little under a day to run right now. So if we're going to extend that period of record, it's going to take more than a day, and that becomes problematic from a computational point of view. But in addition, some of the, as you go back longer, the quality and even the existence of certain data that you need may not be as good as you'd like. We did look, because there's some wet periods and dry periods. I think the 90s were generally wetter than average. There was a dry period in the early thousands, which we did make sure there's kind of representative years within our 20 years as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think there was also an issue with assuming, there was concerns about, the GSFLOW model assumes fixed land use. I think there were some concerns about stretching that out too long.
Yeah, great point.
Okay, so I received a question. How is information as to perched aquifers incorporated into MODFLOW?
I'm wondering if that should be in the later section as we get into the geologic analysis.
Okay, why don't we table that one then? Next question, what time step is used in the model?
Great question. For GSFLOW, because it's doing the surface water interaction, so it's actually, it's doing stream flow on a daily basis, so it uses a daily time step. And for a groundwater, and I'll say I'm not a groundwater modeler, but typically groundwater models, I think, would use monthly or maybe stress periods of a month or maybe 2 weeks, sometimes even longer than a month I've seen. But because we want to get the surface water flows, we need to run it at a daily time step for GSFLOW. Now, when we come to do the nutrient transport model, we're doing transport of solute, or in this case nitrate, through the groundwater, and we believe that's going to be more of a monthly or 2 weekly time step for that model. Okay.
We have a comment. Just want to express the concern that historical stream gauge data may be inaccurate during low flow periods. These gauges were mainly maintained as, quote, flood gauges. Yeah, that is something that we're aware of. There's a Tetra Tech report, I think from circa around 2011 or so, that describes those issues. Al, is there anything you can speak to that?
No, that is a great point. And the plots I had up were log scales, and it got flows in the summer are measured as less than a CFS. Sometimes even a 1/10 of a CFS, and you definitely have to question how accurate that is. And when we, as we're calibrating the model, we keep that in the back of our minds, so to speak.
Yeah, I just want to add that calibrating, my understanding, I'm not a modeler, I'm a geologist, but calibrating the model to these really low flow periods is not something that's been done too much, and it's extremely difficult. So that difficulty is compounded by issues with inaccuracy during low flow periods. So we are aware of these challenges. I think Al's team is especially aware, as they've been working through that calibration recently. So thank you for that comment. I have another comment. Does the model take climate change into account? It seems if climate change is exacerbating conditions, the selection of the validation period becomes even more critical. I think this will be our last question. I want to get moving again. The short answer is yes, we are. One of the 8 scenarios that we're going to ask Geosyntec to evaluate is climate change. And I think what we spent some time talking to the authors of a recent Ventura County climate change assessment that was, I think, published around 2018 or 2019. And they helped us pick a kind of a forecasted climate change scenario, a climate change scenario that is that 75% of their kind of climate modeling runs expect to occur. So we're taking that kind of prediction that 75% of their models agreed on, and we're going to apply that back to 1984 to 2017. And so we're going to look at if these forecasted climate change impacts had occurred during 1994 to 2017, how would that have affected water supply and water demand? So that is a scenario that we will evaluate, and we agree that climate change is exacerbating conditions, and it's something that at the State Water Board we are really mandated by our appointed board to consider and evaluate. So thank you for that question. I think Al probably should keep going. I don't see any other questions. If we didn't sufficiently answer your question, just please let us know, and we'll either circle back to it, or you can always follow up via email.
And hey, Al, when you were speaking, your mic was fading in and out a little bit.
Okay.
I don't know what would help that, but
I'll try and keep it up closer. Does that sound a little better?
that sounds good.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. All right, I'm going to move along into the data that we use to develop the GSFLOW model, and there's a lot of it. I'm going to go fairly fast, and again, this is an overview. Some of this info is in the study plan. I think a lot of it is in the study plan, and of course, the final modeling report are going to have a lot more detail than I can give in about the 20 minutes I got left. So I'm just going to go over some of the input data used for PRMS, which is primarily, the terrain data, which describes the shape of the land, the meteorology, the land use and vegetation and soil types. I'm going to talk a little about the crops and the irrigation, which are important for both the balance of water, but also for when we get to the nutrients, because these crops are also fertilized. And then the MODFLOW input data. I've got a bullet here for the geologic analysis, but that's going to be the next part of the talk given by Daniel B. Stevens. Going to talk a little bit about the groundwater pumping. There's a lot of, that's very important, obviously, for a groundwater model to get the groundwater pumping accurate. There's a lot of wells have measurements or estimates of pumping volumes, but there's also a lot that do not. And we did a supply and demand analysis to estimate those volumes, and that's going to be in another webinar. And then some other details of the model to describe how water moves through the streams, also describe how water can be diverted for other use, by humans essentially. And then finally talk a little bit about the on-site wastewater treatment system, or the ARTS that Alexander mentioned. So we take a DEM, or digital elevation model. We use USGS data for about half of the watershed, kind of mostly the mountains, and we use some 2005 county LIDAR where it was available, which was kind of the flatter portions of the watershed. We run it through a cascading routing tool, which is a tool developed by the USGS, and it then defines a stream network. And the stream network is obviously important because that's where the water accumulates and flows into the streams and it eventually exits the watershed or can flow into the ground as well through the stream bed. So we use the DEM to build kind of represent the physical surface of the model. Then to that, we need to apply rainfall. So we use Gage data. There's about 23 rain gauges in and around the watershed, as shown by the map on the right. These are daily data that goes back to the time step. We're using the daily time step. Some of them have gaps, so we fill them using kind of pretty standard techniques, typically trying to correlate it with a nearby rain gauge to fill in the gap. And then so the plot on the left is an example of rain gauge data over 24 years. And then we use these PRISM 30-year normal precipitations, which is derived from radar images. And we use that to do the spatial interpolation because it provides a more realistic representation of, how we've got generally more precipitation in the upper watershed on the ridges than if we were just to interpolate spatially between the rain gauges. And this was a recommended method recommended by the USGS. We also put on daily minimum and maximum air temperatures, which are important to drive evapotranspiration calculations. So we've got a two-dimensional surface. We've got rainfall hitting it, and then we need to define land use as well as vegetation and soils on the surface, because that affects, whether the water runs off immediately, whether it infiltrates through to the groundwater, how much of that gets returned to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. So these are some of the data sets that we use. We've got percent impervious data from National Land Covered Data Set. We've got vegetation types from US Forest Service. We've got soil depth, and soil conductivities and available water capacity from Sergio. We've also got percent sand, silt, and clay. And so there's a lot of spatial data going into our model. And again, the USGS have some scripts that take all these data and use them to estimate an initial set of parameters that you can use in your PRMS model. So for each of the several 100,000 grid points that we have in the model, it will come up with estimates of the storage, the amount of storage in the buckets in the model, in the schematic that I showed earlier, as well as the rate parameters for how the water can move through the soil into the groundwater or kind of downslope into the next grid point. So once we set the model up, we run it, and that's when the calibration process starts, and we start adjusting some of these parameters to achieve a match of the data. And again, that is going to be webinar number 3. The crops and irrigation, we used Ventura County Agricultural Commission data from 2016 to define where our crops are. They're shown here on the map on the right, in different colors. We grouped them into 3 main types: avocado, citrus, and then kind of everything else. We also delineated the 2 golf courses in the watershed, because obviously they're a big water user, and also this fertilizer on those as well. And then we used Department of Water Resources applied water rates, and that's shown here to come up with the amount of applied water in feet per year for the different crop types. And you can see there's quite a bit of variation from year to year, depending whether it was a wet year, in which case they may not need as much water, or whether it was a hot, dry year, in which case they may need more water. So we use these to put on a amount of irrigation that varied from year to year. And we used ET calculations to also vary the irrigation by month within each calendar year. For the underlying MODFLOW model, we need the geologic analysis to define the different thicknesses of the different alluvial basins, the 4 main basins shown here, and also the types of bedrock in the groundwater model. That's all I'm going to say about that. For the next part of the talk, we'll dive into a lot more detail on that. And I mentioned this before, the groundwater model needs to have pumping volumes, and there are a lot of it. So there's this map here on the right shows the wells within the watershed. Many of these wells have data, whether it's annual, semi-annual, or quarterly, or even monthly. But many of them do not. And in fact, if you can see the symbols here, the symbols that are square, there are no data for them in terms of pumping volumes. So again, we did the supply and demand analysis, which was quite complicated because we have to consider, water that's delivered from casitas to different areas within the watershed. So we're going to have a whole nother webinar describing how we did that. But for now, the takeaway is, if it's one of these wells that have a square symbol, it's estimated volumes. If it doesn't have a square symbol, then there's some amount of reported volumes. You can also see this is color coded by the annual volumes in acre feet per year. So you can see, for example, the red wells, other Foster Park wells down at the bottom of the upper Ventura River. And I think these wells are Miners Oaks as well. So other things that the model needs to define is the hydraulic properties of the stream network. So this will describe, how the water flows down through the system, and where this can be pretty important. We're not doing the hydraulic models. We're not saying we're going to nail the hydraulic calculations of the rivers, but it's important because the width of the river can influence how much interaction there is between the water in the river and the groundwater underneath it. So for the main stem Ventura, shown here in red, as well as the San Antonio, we actually got some HEC-RAS, which is a hydraulic models from the county water protection district, and we ran them at a bunch of different flow rates to quantify the stream width and stream depth as a function of flow rates, and that information went into the model. For the smaller tributaries, we used a regression developed as part of the Ventura surface water hydrology model. We used that up in the tributaries to define the channel width as a function of drainage area. In the watershed, there's 29 surface water diversions per the ERIMS, which is the state's electronic water rights information management system. That's shown here on the map. We went through, so they have self-reported data. We went through and we excluded diversions which had no volumes reported. There were also a couple others that we looked into and determined they were no longer in use. And for each of the other diversions that we left in the model, we used the maximum allowed flow rate. So the ERIMS, the water rights, has a maximum allowed diversion rate that can be used. And we put that in the model, and as part of the calibration, we check in the volumes that the model yields compared to the reported volumes, and maybe making adjustments. In addition, some of these diversions can happen year round. Other ones are restricted to certain seasons within the calendar year, and that is also put into the model. Other diversions and transfers, so these are, I think one of the larger ones is the roadless diversion, which diverts water from the upper Ventura River through the roadless canal into Lake Casitas. So we need to put that into our model, and we have daily data for that. So that works great because we're doing a daily time step. So we just put that in as a transfer from the river to the lake. There historically have been releases from Matilija Reservoir. I think more recently they're keeping it at a lower pool for seismic concerns, but historically they would release it to try to maximize diversions down the roadless canal. There was limited data on that, but we did have water surface elevation data of Matilija, as well as estimates of stage and storage volumes, and we did some calculations to estimate releases. Obviously, Lake Casitas delivers water, and we have annual volumes which we converted to monthly estimates based on kind of our supply and demand analysis. So that is withdrawals from the lake, and those withdrawals can be used for residential use, or they can be used for agriculture, and that's kind of taken into account within our supply and demand analysis. And finally, there's the wastewater treatment plant in the lower part of the river that has an inflow, and we had data to inform what that inflow should be. So finally, for the GSFLOW, the last piece of the puzzle are these ARTs, these on-site wastewater treatment systems. And in fact, this is getting back to the question we had earlier. This is a map of the ARTs. We're showing there's about 3,200 within the watershed. I believe the question was related to some that were missing in the previous work in this vicinity. So I believe we filled that in. We filled that in with some additional data that we got. So we're putting these arts into the model. We're assuming 200 gallons per day comes through each of these arts and into the unsaturated zone within the MODFLOW model. And this was a small part of the water balance, but the reason we're putting it in is primarily so we can get the user to put in the nitrogen loading in the second part of the project. So again, that's an overview of the data and how we use it to set up the model. Pause here again for questions. I'll take any before I wrap up with an overview of the nitrogen MT3D model.
Thank you, Al. We do have a few questions, and we're just going to take them in order. So the first question, will the model be run with PRISM averages for the last 30-year period for average precipitation parameters 1990 to 2020 instead of the weighted period of 1981 to 2010, or does that have to wait for the calibration stage?
I think I understand the question. I may not have explained it, how we're using the PRISM averages. We're not using the averages in an absolute sense. We're using the shape of the average to interpolate between the actual rain gauge data. So we've got daily rain gauge data. So on any given day, we've got 23 points in and around our watershed that have rainfall depths. But the question, our model is distributed over the entire watershed. So the question is, how do we, what's the depths where we don't have the rainfall gauge data? So we just use the shape of the PRISM data to interpolate spatially. So we kind of scale it up and down as needed. So I don't know if that answers the question. Or is it?
That's from William Warwick. Please let us know if that answers that question. Our next question is from Larry Rose. He had a comment that applied irrigation amounts are not realistic. So Larry, I would like to ask if you could provide, or maybe elaborate on that, or provide some concrete data sources that we can cite to improve our inputs. I'm going to give you permission to unmute if you would like to find your name in the participant list. Looks like you might have permission to unmute now.
Yeah, you got me?
Yeah.
Yeah, citrus water demand is much lower than avocado. Citrus can range from 1.5 acre feet to 3 acre feet. Avocado is more typically in the 2 to 3 range, maybe as high as 4 in some locations where people don't know how to irrigate. But the quick look at that range, it just looked inaccurate. But it was hard to hear with the microphone cutting out all the time. It was hard to hear the explanation.
Okay.
Yeah, these are county-specific applied water rates as determined by DWR to maintain healthy crops. So we're looking to be, I'm just seeing the range here, 2.5 to 3.5 is a typical range, and I guess some years it gets as high as 4. In 2013 and 14, they did get very high, and we actually, as part of our balance, decided there's no way that they'd be putting that much on because, well, there wasn't water around for a start. So we did make some adjustments. We didn't use those numbers directly in those kind of extreme drought years. But if you have some references with your numbers, you can send them through.
Yeah, Larry, so if there's additional information you can send to us to cite, we'd really appreciate that. Okay, thank you. Okay, next question. Have you done any One of the larger diversions is the City of Ventura wellfield at Foster Park, directly out of Ventura River bed. Why is that historic data not included? It is. We have that information from the City of Ventura. And I think we have daily time step for some of that groundwater pumping. We have for some of the modeling period, we have daily time step, and I think for some of it, it might be monthly. Al, do you recall?
This is the pumping out of Foster Park?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's just a terminology that is in the model as a well, not as a surface water diversion. I know there's discussion about you know, whether it's effectively taking water from the surface water, but we're putting it in as a well, and the physics of the model will then take care of it in terms of, you know, drawing it out of the surface water. I don't know offhand the temporal resolution of those data.
I do want to add that we have, through an extensive data request effort, we were able to get the actual amount of groundwater pumping from municipal water suppliers in the watershed. So that is not, municipal water supply is not a data gap. It's something that we've actually been able to get the numbers from each of the municipal water suppliers for the entire modeling period, I believe. There are some smaller to mid-size water suppliers where we might not have the full modeling period, but we have parts of it. Okay, so the next question, oh, and if you have more questions about that, please look at the draft data report where we talk about the water pumping data that we do have. It is 10:30. I think we can go through a few more questions here, but if people want to step away for a break, please do so. Our goal is to start the DBSA presentation at 10:45, but
Kevin, I do have the about, I don't know, 5 more slides or so.
Oh, you do?
On the
okay.
MT3D.
Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to table the remaining questions and we'll continue. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I think it's only about 5 slides. This is on the once we've finished with the GSFLOW model, we're going to take the groundwater portion of it, create a separate MODFLOW model, and run the MT3D, which does the solute transport, in this case, tracking nitrate, how it moves, comes from various sources in the watershed, moves into the groundwater, and then can come back into the surface water. So these slides talk about that. So I took one of the earlier slides that used to have PRMS over here in a box, and I just removed PRMS because we're basically taking that piece away from this model. Unfortunately, the MT3D USGS code is not compatible with GSFLOW, so we have to kind of develop a separate MODFLOW model. So obviously, we're going to use the GSFLOW model to determine the boundary conditions that will be fed to the MODFLOW model. So wherever in the GSFLOW model we have water percolating through the soil and coming in to the unsaturated zone, we're going to use those quantities and put them on directly, for example, as boundary conditions on the MODFLOW model. And then we also, in addition to the volumes of water, so I'm just going to note my audio is not great. In addition to the volumes of water, we also need to give it concentrations of nitrogen or mass loads of nitrogen for each of these boundary conditions, so that then the model can then track it through the groundwater model. So that's in a very simplistic terms. If I go back to the GSFLOW schematic with the 3 regions, we now do not have this PRMS region, and we're just really stuck with regions 2 and regions 3, which is the subsurface saturated, unsaturated zones, and the streams and the lakes. So the MODFLOW MT3D model is going to be looking at kind of everything in this ellipse, where we've got arrows crossing the boundary, where we need to define our boundary conditions. So we're going to have, you know, again, the flows are going to come from GSFLOW, and we have to come up with other ways to estimate the nitrogen loadings. And Alexander talked about a lot of the sources of nitrogen in the watershed. You know, we've got agriculture, there's livestock, including horses, the arts, and we've got to come up with ways to estimate those. So this table is from the final study plans. Some of you may have seen it before. And again, as I've said before, we're going to use flow rates from the GSFLOW model. For the runoff and interflow, so that's the water that enters the streams kind of directly from the land without going to the groundwater. We can use literature and land use to estimate what nitrogen or nitrate concentrations may be. There's also wet weather data out there. We can use those to estimate the concentrations of nitrate for those flows that are directly into the streams. For the gravity drainage through the soil, it's a little more complicated. We can use literature studies that have looked at when you apply, for example, fertilizer onto a crop, how much of that is uptaken by the crop itself, how much may kind of leach through and end up in the groundwater. So we kind of do these mass balance calculations, and these are described in this or summarized in this table over here. So that's how we come up with the boundary conditions. And then the goal of the model, or the goal of the calibration portion of the model, is then to match it to calibration data. The calibration data is, we have surface water measurements at numerous locations throughout the major streams within the watershed. And at each of these locations, there'll be a time series of data. So we want to try to, our model should be able to recreate those time series to some degree of accuracy. We also have measurements of groundwater concentrations at several locations in the watershed. And again, they are time series data that we will try to, the goal would be to match those with the model. And these concentrations at the beginning of the modeling period will also be used to set the model initial conditions. We need to give the model initial concentrations to kind of start it off. In addition to these direct measurements, there's also the forensic data that my colleague Brandon discussed earlier that was used in the previous study, and they'll be used to kind of corroborate, they can be used to show, for example, whether the nitrate at a particular location, whether some of that came from these septic systems. So we'll be able to use that to help with the calibration. And that's all I have on the MT3D model. So I don't know if you want to pause for questions or run and get coffee.
Let's just do a few questions, and then we'll take a break. So we are a little behind schedule. So we have more questions than we have time at this moment to answer, but we'll just take the first few. So the next question, first of all, thank you, Al. Okay, the next question was, have you done any bias correction for the PRISM data? The PRISM data may give biased values at areas with higher altitude. This is from Ali Tashdigi. I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly.
I don't think so. I'd have to check back at the method. We used a method recommended by the USGS. So is there any more information on that bias? Is it just something inherent in their radar method, or is it specific to Ventura, or is it more of a?
Let me ask Ellie to unmute. Okay.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
Yes.
Great. Hi. I mean, we've used PRISM data for other projects, other modeling projects, and comparing that to the land-based stations that are available, sometimes in higher altitude, you see a little bit of bias from the PRISM data that is inherent, and we usually use quantum mapping to bias correct data. Just wanted to see if you have encountered that, or have done any comparison with the land-based station to see if there's any bias in this area or not.
So you were using PRISM kind of taken daily or in kind of real time? Because I think we're using just the shape of the PRISM, and then we're scaling it to match the gauge location. So maybe that our approach inherently does correct for that bias.
So you're just using the shape to downscale the data, or well, basically just using the land basis data in terms of the values, the exact values of the number.
Correct. So our method does reproduce the gauge data, and that was something we
you don't directly use any prism measurements.
No, we just use the kind of, I think that the 30-year normals to kind of which define the shape.
Okay.
And I think we had 30-year normals, slightly different shapes for each month, but you know, that's pretty minor detail.
Yeah.
So yeah, we shouldn't be biased.
Question,
yeah, great.
Okay, thank you for that question. We've got a few more. I just want to kind of call out that we have William Warwick. We have one question we want to circle back to with you, and a tabled question about perched aquifers. So we'll come back to those. We have 2 questions from Larry Yee. One is about how the CDFW study will be integrated into the State Water Board's hydrology study. And the second question is about the pace of this modeling project. So we'll come back to both of those questions. There's one technical question here that I want to address. So this is the final outstanding question that I've caught. So this is from Christian Labor. Were ag applied water rates uniformly applied across the modeling area, or was there a consideration of the climatic variability that occurs within the watershed? Notably, coastal summer temperatures average in the low 70s. So that's coastal in the low 70s, and that's an average, whereas inland temperatures are typically in the 90s. Was this type of geographic variability considered with respect to applied water?
Yeah, I think we just used the rates there directly. We, you know, we did think about the coastal piece. That was a pretty small part of the overall budget. So if we, you know, if those rates, irrigation rates were reduced a bit, I don't think we'd have a large bearing on the outcome of the model.
Okay, so it sounds like that's something we'll keep an eye on, especially if we have kind of issues with calibration. And Christian, I did give you, I think, permission to unmute if you want to follow up on that. Okay, so it's, oh, hello.
No, it's just there's an extreme variation in the watershed, not just in temperature, but also solar radiation, evapotranspiration, humidity. So it would have a profound effect, and there's a gradient across the watershed.
Yeah, we do. We the temperature we apply to the model does take, you know, elevation, and I think we have a gauge nearer the coast as well that's kind of fed in as well. But I'd have to double check that.
Davis has UC Davis has a number of crop coefficients and ET values across the area, and I would recommend utilizing their data sources as they've done a number of detailed ET studies across Ventura County that might be more present a more accurate representation than just a uniform value.
Okay. Is that a link you can drop in the chat or something?
Yeah, if that's something you could provide to us, that'd be helpful. Okay, so thank you, Christian, for that comment. And we look forward to getting that information from you. I think we're going to take a break. We're about 8 minutes, maybe 13 minutes behind schedule, which isn't too bad. So let's meet back at 10:55. So we'll take a 10-minute break. We'll meet back at 10:55, and we'll pick up with the Daniel B. Stevens presentation. They're going to review our geologic analysis and present new information. And we'll, we haven't forgotten about these tabled questions, so we'll try and get to those soon. So thank you. See you soon. So, Steve, would you like to take it away?
Thanks, Kevin. This component of today's webinar summarizes the geologic analysis of the Ventura River watershed that was performed by Daniel B. Stevens and Associates. DBSNA submitted its revised analysis to the state board in March of 2020. Based on comments and new data received from stakeholders in 2020, further revisions were made to that analysis where appropriate. The resulting geologic analysis will be used in conjunction with other information as described in the project study plan to assign the three-dimensional model layer geometry, initial model hydraulic properties, for example, hydraulic conductivity, and the presence of boundary conditions. So there's an outline of my talk today here. I'm going to provide you with an introduction, describe the sources of information that we used in the analysis, describe the methods that we used, present some selected maps and geologic cross sections that, and also present a map of the alluvium thickness throughout the basins. And we'll describe some of the edits that were made following our submittal of the revised geologic analysis memorandum. From that point, we'll change speakers, but then we'll be describing how the model was used as the basis for the construction of the GSFLOW groundwater model grid. Geologic analysis was performed by mapping the three-dimensional extent of superficial geologic units within the Ventura River watershed, and the results were plotted on a series of geologic cross-sections. The cross-section locations were placed in order to be consistent with previous cross-sections developed in the watershed and to generally follow the main surface water bodies. The horizontal extent and depth of the geologic cross-sections were also determined based on the presence and depth of water supply wells in the watershed. This figure displays the presence and indicates the depths of wells within the watershed based on data received from the Ventura County Watershed Protection District. Geologic maps, boring logs, existing geologic studies, and cross-sections in the current Bulletin 118 basin boundaries were reviewed in order to assess the extent of superficial geologic units. Previous studies on the extent and thickness of the alluvium in the basins included Turner from 1971, Stahl, Gardner, and Dunn, 92, Fugro Rest, 2002, Hopkins Groundwater Consultants, shown as HGC here, in 2007, DBSNA 2011, and Cured Groundwater published in 2016. Previous studies of bedrock in the watershed consulted also include DWR 1933 and Rockwell et al. In 1984 and the California Department of Geology in 1991. Boring logs were available from DWR, Ventura County Watershed Protection District, Hopkins Groundwater, Cured Groundwater. Numeric Solutions provided some, Caltrans, and we took some from the GeoTracker website operated by the State Water Resources Control Board. Well locations used in the geologic analysis are displayed here. The green circles indicate the use of a driller or a geologic log. Blue squares indicate the use of geophysical log. For example, Fugro 2002 and Advanced Geoscience in 2014 provided some information. Red circle outlines indicate locations where well log information was projected onto the cross sections. Where multiple wells are present in the same general location and would overlap if projected onto the cross sections, the well with the most detailed geologic log available was projected. All well logs, of course, used in this geologic analysis have been compiled and are available on request. Ground surface elevation was based on LiDAR data that was obtained from the Ventura County Public Works Agency and otherwise, where it was available. And otherwise, we used digital elevation data published by the USGS. Geologic maps, pardon me, geologic maps used in the analysis include the east half of the Santa Barbara 30 by 60 minute quadrangle prepared by the California Geologic Survey. The coverage included most of the Ventura River watershed and all of the Bulletin 118 groundwater basins. Geologic nomenclature used by the California Geologic Survey was adopted for use in reporting the results of the geologic analysis. DBSNA received data from numeric solutions regarding the presence of tertiary bedrock outcrops, specifically the Pico Formation, in areas mapped previously as active wash deposits and stream deposits. DBSNA observed these outcrops during a field survey in September of 2018. Also at the time, DBSNA observed tertiary bedrock outcrops of the Rincon Shale in an area of the San Antonio Creek mapped as outwash on previous geologic maps. DBSNA incorporated the presence of these tertiary bedrock outcrops in the geologic analysis. For the northernmost portion of the Ventura River watershed, the eastern 3/4 of the Cuyama 30 by 60 minute quadrangle prepared by the USGS were used. A tectonic and physiographic map of the White Ledge Peak and Matilaha quadrangles prepared by the USGS, specifically Miner and Brandt, published in 2015, was also used. The first step in the geologic analysis was estimation of the horizontal extent and thickness of undifferentiated alluvium, excluding areas where alluvium is considered thin and non-water-bearing and thin alluvial channels in bedrock areas. For the purpose of this analysis, quaternary alluvial deposits, wash deposits, alluvial fan deposits, alluvial and colluvial deposits, stream terrace deposits, active beach deposits, active coastal estuarine deposits, porolic deposits, and artificial fill are all considered as undifferentiated alluvium. The Saugus Formation was also considered to be alluvial deposits based on its description as, quote, weakly consolidated alluvial deposits composed of sandstone and siliceous shale, gravel, and cobbles in a sandy matrix, unquote. The Bulletin 118 boundaries largely correspond to the extent of the surficial alluvium, excluding thin alluvial channels that underlie streams in the mountain bedrock areas, the area of Lake Casitas, various areas of landslide deposits throughout the Ventura River watershed, in areas where alluvium is considered thin and non-water bearing. For example, alluvium to the east of the Ventura River in the vicinity of cross-section FF prime that I'll show shortly, that was formerly included in the Upper Ventura River Bulletin 118 boundary prior to the boundary modifications that were approved in 2016. A simplified geologic map was then created by assigning each geologic unit, for example, undifferentiated quaternary alluvium or primarily Pleistocene, claystone, sandstone, siltstone, pardon me, in order to assign physical characteristics, for example, hydraulic conductivity for use in the model. This map shows the specific locations of the cross sections that were developed and included in the geologic analysis memorandum. Section AA prime is a north-south cross section that follows the main stem of the Ventura River and up into the North Fork of Matilaha Creek. Section BB prime is an east-west cross section that runs from the Upper Ventura River Basin into the Ojal Valley Basin. CC prime runs southwest to northeast generally and generally follows the San Antonio Creek. DD prime is a south to north from south of the Upper Ojai Basin to the Upper Ojai Basin and then through the Ojai Valley Basin. EE prime is another east-west cross section in the southerly portion of the watershed that passes through the widest area of alluvium in the lower Ventura River Basin. FF prime passes through the Upper Ventura River Basin, San Antonio Creek, Lion Creek, and the Upper Ojai Valley Basin for an east-west cross-section. This is one of the example cross-sections that were developed for the memorandum. This is the AA prime that follows the main stem of the Ventura River up into the North Fork of North Fork of the Matilaha Creek, sorry. The alluvial sediment thickness was estimated from review of boring logs, geophysical logs, previous geologic studies, and the location of non-alluvial bedrock outcrops. The State Water Resources Control Board performed the first round of review of boring logs available from the Ventura County Watershed Protection District in the Upper Ventura, Lower Ventura, and Upper Ojai Valley basins. And they estimated the depth of the alluvium for each well. DBSNA then reviewed the state board analysis against available boring logs and previous geologic studies as a point of quality assurance. This is another cross-section that was presented in the geologic analysis memorandum. This one goes from southwest generally to northeast, follows in general the San Antonio Creek. Within the Ojai Valley Basin, previous analysis of geophysical logs from wells within the basin was used to map the alluvial thickness. This is work that was done by DBSNA in 2011. This previous mapping was updated based on newly received well logs. The geophysical log analysis at that time also identified the presence of aquifers and semi-confining units within the Ojai Valley Basin. This is presents a map of the alluvial thickness. The bottom of the alluvium elevation was interpolated throughout the watershed using bedrock elevation data for each location from which lithologic data was present, using a combination of contouring, manual contouring based on professional judgment and geostatistical methods, for example, kriging. Previously developed maps of bottom of elevation within the Ventura watershed developed by Turner and Stahlgardner and Dunn were also used to inform the bottom of alluvium elevation. This figure displays the isopack or thickness of the resulting alluvium at the scale of the 330-foot grid cells that are being used in the numerical model. Following mapping of the undifferentiated alluvium, additional geologic analysis was conducted to map the three-dimensional extent of the bedrock geologic units that are used for water supply in the watershed, and to map the presence of structural features, for example, faults. The bedrock geology analysis relied primarily on available geologic maps. When discrepancies in geologic interpretation occurred between various maps, the newest geologic map covering an area was used. In cases where the landslide deposits were mapped to cover bedrock, older preliminary geologic maps were referenced that did not include the landslide deposits. In addition, Larry Garola in 2018 and Rockwell 84 were referenced in regards to the orientation of the Arroyo Parita Fault and other nearby faults located along the Ventura River. Well logs were also considered where available to confirm the bedrock lithology. Quaternary and Pleistocene alluvial deposits were delineated based on the age of the map surface units on the respective geologic maps discussed previously, and also based on previous cross sections developed by Turner in 1971. A draft of the geologic memorandum was distributed for input and comment early on, and comments were addressed in the revised geologic analysis memo that Kevin referred to originally. That was published in and submitted to the board in March of 2020. After that publication, it was noticed in the draft Upper Ventura River Groundwater Sustainability Plan that discrepancies were noted between the conceptual model in the groundwater sustainability plan and that of our revised geologic analysis memo. Based on that, we corresponded with the GSA and obtained new boring logs and additional information and data. After the additional review of that information, the above edits were made to the interpretation of the alluvial thickness. You can see here on the map that location number 1, the Santa Ana Boulevard Bridge We made minor changes based on newly received boring logs, the minor changes being less than 10 feet. At location number 2, where it's well number 4 north, 23 west, 15A02S, we edited the alluvial thickness data to thicken the alluvium based on review of the boring log in that location. Location number 3 on the map, State Route 150 bridge, we made some minor edits to be consistent with the newly received boring logs. And at location number 4 on the map, we maintained the absence of alluvium in the bedrock outcropped areas, but increased the alluvial thickness in surrounding cells, recognizing that more recent surveys, for example, Miner and Brandt published in 2015, didn't observe those outcrops in the same configuration as older geologic maps. And lastly, this map shows the basin boundaries and the areas of the thinner alluvium that are not included within the basin boundaries that were observed in our data throughout the basin. And these are these orange colored areas that are shown outside the basin areas. I don't know if you see my pointer on the map here, but up in these regions right here. Those were included and addressed in the model. So with that, that's a natural place to pause for questions before we talk about how this information was then translated into use for the numerical model.
Thank you, Steve. We've got 2 outstanding questions that were asked earlier, so I think this is a good time to circle back to those. The first question, how is information as to perched aquifers incorporated into MODFLOW?
Hi, Steve, this is Greg. Would you like me to take this one?
Sure.
Hi, this is Greg Schnarr with Daniel B. Stevens, and I'll be giving the rest of this presentation. And in a general sense, the answer to the question is that MODFLOW and GSFLOW can incorporate perched aquifers. And specifically for our model, getting a little ahead of ourselves, but in the current calibration runs we have, we do appear to have some perched groundwater in certain zones of the model domain. So there are some areas where we're seeing perched groundwater within the domain in our current runs.
We have a second question from the same person. The city of Ventura wellfield taps river flow behind a weir dam. In other words, it is unique in terms of functionally being more like a reservoir than an aquifer. Seems more appropriate to treat it as a diversion from this reservoir capture from river flow, and then in parentheses, underground and above ground. Okay.
Yeah, so the subsurface dam at Foster Park, I think, is what the question is about. We reviewed some historical documentation of the location of that dam, and it's incorporated in the model as what's called a horizontal flow barrier package. And it is in the subsurface there in the approximate configuration that we think it exists based on historical information. And the well pumping there is based on the screen intervals of the information we have of that diversion. So it's represented as accurately as we think we can in the model as pumping from a very shallow zone right underneath the river and right next to a horizontal flow barrier. I believe is how we have it currently implemented.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on groundwater or geology? The tabled questions that we have are not quite related to groundwater and geology, so I want to ask those at the beginning. I'll bring those up at the beginning of the larger discussion period. So if I don't hear any more questions in the next 15, 30 seconds, I think we'll just continue with the presentation. Also can raise your hand, type it into chat, send a carrier pigeon.
All right, would you like me to go ahead and can
Yes,
everyone
please.
see my screen?
I see a question screen.
All right, well, we're gonna just finish this, and I'd say I'm the last person to keep you from lunch, but in a webinar, I guess you all can be eating lunch now. But I'll finish this out just talking about how we implemented all of that information that Steve just went through in setting up the zones in the GSFLOW model. And I'll just point out a couple of things going back through the presentation. You know, as Steve pointed out, really let's see if I can minimize this. The horizontal extent of the model is the entire watershed, but we're really focusing on the area near the surface water bodies and where there are active pumping wells. And that's, so although the model extends throughout the entire watershed, you know, the area of greatest focus is really the area that's bounded by the presence of these wells, both horizontally and vertically. And so just keep that in mind. The other I'll point out is, you know, this simplified geologic map was based on the earlier geologic maps that Steve showed you, and it was also a starting point for us setting up the GSFLOW zones. So you'll see some similarities there. And so when we say the GSFLOW zones, what we mean are every 330-foot grid cell in MODFLOW and GSFLOW is assigned a zone, and that zone, within that zone, has common properties like hydraulic conductivity and storativity, and other parameters that relate to recharge. And so, you know, in a large scale model like this, there is some grouping to generalize that. And so this map shows those zones on the uppermost part of the model. So it's 330 feet cells horizontally within the entire watershed. And then we have 7 vertical layers. And this is showing the uppermost layer, so layer 1. And this is really, I'll point out, this is subject to change. This is based partially on the geologic information, and it's also been informed by the ongoing model calibration. So this is the current hot off the press sort of way that we have been zoning the model at this point. And so within each of these zones, there's a common, for example, hydraulic conductivity value. And so right now there's, although it says up to 28, there's a couple that are skipped as placeholders. So I think we actually have 26 zones at this point. And I'll point out some of these. So this whole entire modeling effort really started as an expansion originally of a model that Daniel B. Stevens put together for the OBGMA originally in 2011 and was recently updated last year. Jordan can correct me, but I believe that's the model that is being used for their GSP efforts. And so we've maintained the zones we had in that model within OBGMA. So there's a different approach within Ojal because we wanted to benefit from all of the work that we had done to calibrate that model over the years. Within the other Bolton 118 basin, the zoning is largely based on the mapping of either what we call young or old alluvium. And we've also established different zones within certain parts of some of these basins as we've moved forward with calibration. So you'll see, for example, the upper Ventura basin is broken out into several different zones. The superficial geology was just based on the mapping. You'll see these thin alluvium channels in the bedrock areas. In some cases, you know, we did connect those, so there was one long stream channel with a, you know, alluvium around it to maintain the ability for the model to simulate the surface water groundwater interaction in those channels. So I think this, you know, is a very complicated map. So I can answer any questions about it, but what I'll probably do is move vertically downwards. I guess one other thing I'll note is, of course, we have Lake Casitas in here as a, you know, it's a separate area that is covered by what we call the lake package. So as we move downwards, this is the next model layer down, layer 2. And the distinction here is we're moving deeper. And where alluvium, for example, is thicker than 50 feet, that alluvium would then extend into 2 different zones. anywhere besides Ojal, where the zones really were maintained based on our zones from our previous OBGMA model. And so if I flip between 1 and 2, you'll see here we no longer have the relatively thin alluvium channels in the bedrock areas. So we're moving vertically downwards in the model. This is the bottom of layer 3. And in areas here, we've gone deeper there. So we're below the presence of alluvium, for example, in the upper Ventura. If you go back and look at those cross sections, one really distinctive feature of this watershed in these basins is just how much deeper the Ojai Basin is. So that's why you'll continue to see much deeper alluvial layers here than you do in the other basins. And so this is the end of the model for much of the Bulletin 118 basins. And we only really have it extending deeper than this due to Ojai and the deeper layers there. So I move downwards, and now we're really just looking at the 2 zones that we had previously designated in Ojai and some of the surrounding bedrock units. And as I move deeper, this is layer 5. This is really the bowl shape of Ojai. So we're moving downwards in the bowl. So you're seeing the sort of the spatial representation of that getting smaller and smaller. And so this is really the bottom of the alluvium in the Ojai Basin. And then this is the bedrock that underlies that, the Ojai Basin. So again, very complicated, lots of numbers here and colors, but I'm happy to answer any questions in any more detail than I've gone through already.
So Greg, is this a good time for questions on what you've just been sharing?
Yeah, this is the end of our presentation.
Okay. Are there any other questions on geology or groundwater modeling? We did have a comment from Jordan Kier that we are not using that model for the GSP per se. That's, I think, something we could follow up with offline, but.
Well, I did say it, Jordan can correct me, so thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. Any technical questions or technical comments on geology or groundwater? If not, I'm going to kind of open it up to some of the broader questions that I've tabled so far. Okay. So we had a question from Larry Yee. How will the CDFW study be integrated in with the State Water Board's hydrology study? So Dan Worth, my supervisor, could you speak to that, please?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So as I showed earlier in my my presentation, I showed a roadmap of our overall effort, and right now we're in the research and information gathering phase, developing surface water groundwater model. CDFW has been conducting flow studies, developing recommendations. Our next phase is to go through a process to develop a balanced flow objective. And as part of that process, I think one of the scenarios that we would look at as a flow objective is implementation of the recommended CDFW flows. And we could run scenarios in our modeling system that could include something like, if the CDFW flow recommendation was a requirement, let's say that was a flow requirement, we could run that through our modeling systems and evaluate potential impacts to water supply, potential impacts to other public trust resources. And so that could be one scenario that we would look at, and we would likely look at many scenarios. And as part of that process, again, we would have public input opportunities. We would document, the results of our scenario evaluations in CEQA documents and in staff reports. And so that is a potential scenario that we would look at as we move into our next phase to develop balanced flow objectives.
Okay, I was muted. So we have a question. Is the state board team reviewing the comments that were submitted to CDFW? Yes. Yes, we are. Dan, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, we're certainly taking a look at those comments, and we're still in the process of reviewing the draft recommendation. And again, as we go through a process to develop a balanced flow objective, there will be a lot of other public input opportunities, and that there will likely be comments on our proposed objectives and scenarios and alternatives. And so I'm sure we'll have a lot more discussion on what scenarios that we look at.
Dan, is this a good time to speak to how, well, I just want to add that we are developing a draft unimpaired flow scenario that we expect to get results on internally soon. And that information is something that I think was widely commented on and also stated within the CFW draft flow recommendations. That is information that they, I think, will use. Dan, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'm looking for other questions here. So this is we're at the end of the webinar at this point. Well, we have until noon for questions. It's about 11:27. So I guess I'm going to bring up a tabled question from earlier. This is pretty technical, related to the nitrogen transport model. But yeah, please start raising hands and asking questions if there's anything else you'd like to ask about. So a question from William Warwick. And I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. So question, I did not see a response to whether or not the 1.23 milligrams per liter statistic is fixed or variable as a function of aquifer levels as a percentage of capacity. So maybe either regional board or Geosyntec, if someone could speak to that.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I think it was in a 2010 Ventura County Watershed Protection District report that we got the value from. And I think Alexander might have already addressed that question. I think it was based on 20-something groundwater well data collected. I can scroll up and find what he put in as a response.
Okay. So yeah, this is kind of a general statement. If you've been asking technical questions and we ask that if you're not adequately answering your question, please follow up with us, any of the water board staff. And if we've asked that you provide information to help kind of clarify a data source, please again follow up with us and help provide that information so we can improve our model inputs. Okay, we have a question from Bruce Kubler. What is the schedule for release of balanced flow objective?
So this is Dan Worth, and I can take a shot at that. We are in the process of outlining our next phase, so I don't have specific timelines that I could share right now, but I will say that a process to develop a flow objective and implement a flow objective through a policy or a regulation or potentially a voluntary agreements or other stakeholder-led efforts, it's something that takes time. There's a lot of public interaction that we have to work through. So there'll be comment periods and workshops, and then the CEQA process will have a whole set of documentation that we'll have to develop, and ultimately we would take something to our state water board, and they make the ultimate balancing decisions and approve or modify our proposal. And so it's an effort that is likely to take a couple of years to work through.
Okay. So there was a comment about the speed of this study. And I just want to note that we have spent a lot of time since 2017 working with stakeholders and agencies to incorporate data and information and to address comments. As I said at the beginning of the webinar, we've done 4 public comment periods. So I hope folks can see that we are making progress towards actually releasing the draft models, and we're moving as quickly as possible to make that happen. And we made a decision earlier this year to postpone development of 7 of our 8 GSFLOW scenarios in order to get the draft models and draft model report out earlier. When might the draft balance flow objective be released? Another question from Bruce Kubler.
So we will go through a process to develop a scientific basis report or a staff report, and that'll be something that the public sees drafts of, and that report will outline our proposed objective and likely outline the range of alternatives that we'll be considering as we start a CEQA process. So there will be information within a staff report, and then the CEQA process has, again, draft documents that the public will see, and it has scoping meetings and workshops, and so there will be multiple opportunities where we present documentation on what our proposal is and what the range of alternatives are. And again, the process to get through our staff report and a CEQA process, it's something that takes a couple of years, but there will be documents that are available to the public throughout that time period. But the adoption of a flow objective and a regulation or policy, that's something that goes to our state water board members. They have to make the final decision to adopt something or not. And that final adoption is likely to, be a couple of years from now.
And it's worth emphasizing that adoption of a flow objective is separate from implementation of that flow objective. And so that implementation could take a number of different routes, as Dan has stated, from regulatory to voluntary. Any other questions, technical questions, non-technical questions? We've got another 25 minutes. I'm happy to unmute people if you'd like me to. Okay. Well, I guess while people digest that and maybe think of any final questions that they want to ask, I'm just going to share some information on just some reminders on what's coming next for this webinar series. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So can everyone see the full presentation, the roadmap that takes up the full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to click to the end. Okay. So just clicking through these slides here. Okay, so just as a reminder, we have 2 more webinars, May 19th, so that's 2 weeks from this morning. And the topic of that webinar will be the representation of water demand and distribution in the groundwater surface water model. And again, this is preliminary information that we are soliciting technical comments on. Webinar 3 is 3 weeks after May 19th, so it's on June 9th, same time, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. on a Wednesday. We'll be presenting our preliminary results for calibration and validation of the groundwater surface water model, as well as next steps and how to continue to stay involved. We are soliciting technical comments, so we've heard a lot of great feedback today. We encourage you to submit those technical comments to us by Friday, June 25th at the email address below, instreamflows@waterboards.ca.gov. We have been writing down all these questions, so if they are not submitted, we still have a record of them and we'll consider them. As I've stated, each meeting has a unique RSVP link, so if you want to join those other webinars, you need to go and RSVP for them in addition to RSVPing for this one. There's a question in chat. Okay, I want to come back to that in 1 second. I just want to give this information. So this is where you can go to access the slides and the meeting recording. So we're going to post the meeting recording to our website. We'll have a link on our Instream Flow Unit website with the YouTube. It'll be a link to a YouTube video, a recording of this presentation, and we'll also have copies of all of these slides that we're going to upload to an FTP folder. That's a file transfer protocol folder that we've had available to share large files with our TAC. So you can take a screenshot of this slide or email me for the information. I would hope that you can copy this down, or we'll get 50 emails in about 5 minutes. So you can go to this website and just log in with the username and password. And you can go and download the slides. We'll have the PDFs of the slides there. And we'll also include a link to where the video is posted, which will be on our unit's website, as I understand it. So we'll make sure that you have access to the slides and the link. And as I've been saying, if you have additional questions, technical or non-technical, please contact any of the Waterboard staff. We're happy to provide more context or answer your questions so that you can fully provide us the technical comments that we are requesting. If you have trouble accessing any of the slides or recording, please contact myself. And I'm just going to repeat all of the Waterboard's contact info here. This is a link to our website, which I understand you can't click on as part of a presentation. So perhaps we can get that posted in chat shortly. So I'm just going to leave this up, and we have a question from Ali. How will the surface water quality processes, in parentheses, and nutrients be simulated? So this sounds like a question about the nitrogen, related to the nitrogen transport model. Can I hand that over to maybe Geosyntec or Regional Board?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. This is Al. I can start with that. And apologies, I've got a little bit of background noise. Hopefully my audio can cut through it. There will be some, that's actually a good question. We're going to model the tracking of nitrate through the groundwater. The mass balances that do it at the surface are going to look at other forms of nitrogen as well, but by the time it gets to the groundwater, it's assumed that it's into the nitrate form. There will be calibration, which will include denitrification rate costs and things like that as well, if nitrate is lost to the atmosphere as well. So does that answer the question? I can't see the chat.
Hey, Al, I guess this is Greg. I'll just add, I mean, a real simple answer to the question is it'll be with the model MT3D-USGS. So that will be the modeling platform. And, that's one thing I could refer you to is the description of the processes and how they're simulated there in terms of loading and advection and dispersion and loss. I see the question, isn't that only for groundwater, from the same person? And yes, that's a good point. So our study plan for this, which is up on the State Board's website, describes this. But in this case, we're actually taking, at the end of the groundwater flow model calibration, the process is to take that to develop a standalone MODFLOW only groundwater model based on the boundary conditions coming out of GSFLOW, and then use MODFLOW linked with MT3D USGS to simulate the nutrient transport. So the nutrient aspect of this project really is focused only, at least from a modeling perspective, on the groundwater portion of the domain. So that groundwater model will have boundary conditions like nutrient that relate to nutrients, but the actual simulated portion of the domain is groundwater.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for the answers. Anyone else? We can be here till noon. There's more
Hey, Kevin, this is Dan Worth. And I just wanted to take a second to, again, highlight something that you said earlier about public comment periods. You know, we're holding these webinars and we're taking technical comments on some of this technical information that we're presenting. And I just wanted to point out that once we have a draft model documentation and a draft model ready to go out to the public, we'll put that out to the public for additional comment period, and take those final public comments and incorporate or update any information that we need to, and develop a final version of the model and final version of the model documentation. So while there's a technical comment period now, we will have another comment period, and at that point you'll have access to the documentation and the model, and have the opportunity to provide additional comments on this project. So this comment period is not the last chance to comment on this project.
Yeah, and the comment period for the draft models and model report will be 60 days long, and will include a 2-day local training event for local modelers to learn how to use the model. So our goal is to train people, train our local experts during the comment period, hopefully near the beginning of it, and then they can learn how to use it, and then also provide comments.
And just along those lines, there was a question of why do things take so long, and this kind of gets to that. A big part of our project has been public input and holding meetings and taking feedback on various reports and memos, and so this building in a public process does add to the timeline of our project, but we feel that it makes for a better product at the end, and also something that's more useful if people have been involved along the way. Like Kevin was saying, it's possible that there's a little bit more buy-in, and other groups may end up using this tool that will be available for the watershed. And so the public process, it's really important for us, and I think for the community, but it does add some time to the timeline. But that's something we think is worthwhile to do. So I just wanted to add a comment about that to the questions about timelines and why things take so long.
And also just unforeseen technical challenges occur. Figuring out how to represent certain things in the model sometimes takes longer than expected, but we've been able to work through some of those problems. We have a technical question. I hope the PRISM data is checked to make sure the shape being used does not shift between the 1981 to 2010 period and the 1990 to 2020 period.
Yeah, this is Al again. We can take a look at that. I know when we did that part of the processing, it didn't have that latest period. So the fact that we're interpolating to actual rain gauge values, I don't think it would have a huge impact either way. But that may be interesting to see if climate change is potentially changing those shapes.
So we'll write that comment down. Thank you. Does anyone want us to go back to a slide in particular? I've got the slide up right now showing where we'll be putting up the, okay, so by close of business today, we'll get the copies of all slides from each of the 3 presentations up on this FTP folder. There'll be PDFs so that you can download all the presentations, and we'll get the meeting recording posted online as soon as possible too. We'll in the FTP, we'll also include a link to the meeting recording, which I think will be posted on YouTube. So that folks can access that information. And as a reminder, you can always contact any of us to have clarifying questions or additional conversations or discussion. It's about 11:45. What else is cooking out there? Are there any hands that are raised? Looks like people are starting to disconnect. Well, I'm going to kind of make a last call for questions. And if you're still formulating that question, you can just give us kind of a heads up and we can hang on. Otherwise, we will end the meeting and look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good day and you stay safe out there. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.